There are a lot of people who believed that Donald Trump was reckless enough to lead us into a war, but if you were smart enough to guess that it would be a trade war and not an actual physical war, then congratulations. Ever since Donald Trump announced his intention to levy tariffs against imported steel and aluminum late last week, much to the surprise and chagrin of many, not only in his own party, but in his own administration, who were bowled over by the announcement, people have been concerned about the retaliatory effects that this tariff would have and the detrimental effect it will have on our economy in sweeping ways. Steel and aluminum are used in just about everything from goods you purchase at the grocery store to your cars to construction work, which is an interesting situation given that the president's next major legislative achievement involves a massive infrastructure overhaul, which will no doubt be made vastly more expensive by the imposition of these tariffs. But you might ask, and this is a good instinct if you are asking this question, how is it that the president has the power to impose pretty much purely by his own will, tariffs that almost everyone, certainly everyone on the right who has any experience with economics, agree are bad policy both politically and economically? Well, the answer is the president, by the Constitution, doesn't have this authority. Rather, Congress, as it's grown lazy and indolent over time, has ceded many of its constitutionally delegated powers to the executive branch. And thus, the president is now able to levy tariffs, and there's really not a whole lot anyone can do to stop him other than plead. And of course, our president likes to dig his heels in the more that his ideas are opposed. So effectively, we're having a bit of a monarchical moment where good is defined pretty much based solely on the president's discretion, and he has the absolute and unchecked power of the full weight of the United States government behind him and can therefore enact his will on a large scale and impact the quality of lives of the rest of us. This is a little bit of a pre-Magna Carta King John moment. And if you're troubled by it, you should be, because there is no balance of power here, and there's really nothing that any of us can do. And it's especially shocking when you consider the fact that his closest advisors were bowled over by this announcement and believed that they were at least 2 or 3 weeks away from the announcement of tariffs. Policy papers hadn't been written on whether or not this was a good idea. Economic studies hadn't been conducted. So this really was something that the president got into his head and then just decided to go and do. And there are absolutely no checks on power in this case, which is deeply troubling if you believe in rule of law, because in this instance, rule of law is effectively nothing other than the president's own judgment, and in this case, it's a very bad judgment. And for those in the administration who are rather oligarchically claiming that these imports will amount to effectively pennies in price increases and that doesn't really matter, which is a very elitist attitude, quite frankly, then it's a troubling moment. And it certainly looks like, even though this economic protectionism is being enacted in the name of economic security, which is an element of national security that has risen recently, and President Trump particularly likes to tout it, and it's a deeply troubling rationale because it's not that clearly defined and it has far-reaching powers. But even though we're enacting these tariffs in the name of protection of the American worker and in the name of economic welfare and the benefit of the quality of life, it's actually going to do the opposite of that. And you can point to a whole wealth of historical evidence that shows that, but unless the president is open-minded and willing to actually engage in a reasoned debate about the subject, there's nothing that anybody can do. Now, of course, Congress, since they ceded the authority to the president to begin with, could ostensibly enact some measure which would reverse the piece of legislation that gave over this power to the president. But what's the likelihood that they're going to do that? Instead, we're all going to sit back in horror and watch as prices go through the roof as a result of tariffs. And To further cement the idea that this is an example of cognizant government, which we've talked about before, which is the organs of government enervated by the will of a singular man and bowing really to his wishes, and now we've oriented political good and bad really to the value, judgment, and discretion of the single man. We also have not only the whole collected presidency is sort of run roughshod over, and nothing but the president's will matters in this case, but you also have the ability to disavow historical evidence, to disavow the advice of advisors and economists and various people who are in positions to know the historical impact of tariffs and to know that they tend to drive prices through the roof and to have negative impacts on consumers, and that the president can simply say, well, that's not true. In fact, the very claim upon which these tariffs are based, the idea that the steel industry in America has been utterly decimated, is simply not true if one looks at the economic numbers. But these facts become utterly irrelevant in light of the fact that the president simply chooses to disregard them and is instead going to pursue his own will. This is an example of executive cognizance, and it is a deeply troubling one at that.